In The Godfather, Peter Clemenza is one of the more loved characters in the first film and serves as a caporegime to Don Vito Corleone. But what happened to him, and why wasn't he in part 2? Early in the second film, we discover that Clemenza died of a heart attack off camera, as Fredo and Frank Pentangeli bring it up in a conversation. But listen to what Sitchy says right after.
We were all upset about that, Frankie. Heart attack, huh?
No, there was no heart attack.
Just by the way he says, it makes you wonder if he really did have a heart attack, and if not, who whacked him? Before we jump into what happened, let's take a look at who Clemenza really was. Clemenza was one of the original caporegimes for Vito Corleone, when Vito began putting together the empire. Him and Vito first met when Peter needed a place to hide his guns and gave them to Vito so the cops wouldn't find them. The collections of guns he had were worth a lot, and in a deleted scene he is seen, along with Vito selling them. Ever since that point, Vito and Clemenza became friends, along with Tessio and Genko as well. They began getting involved in small crimes to make extra money on the side. Fast forward, and once Vito took care of Don Fanucci, he garnered an immense amount of respect from Clemenza, who realized Vito was fit to be the big boss. He was loyal to Vito throughout their rise and became a trusted associate, helping Vito with his street smarts during the Olive Oil War in 1933, and later helping his son Michael in his hit job on McCluskey and Salazzo. Controversy with Michael. Now fast forward, Vito had retired and gave his operations over to his youngest son Michael. There was some controversy. Clemenza was mad that his territory was getting chipped away at by Barzini. Clemenza requested to Michael that he break off from the family and start his own. Michael responds that once they make the move to Nevada, he can. And this was the last we see of Peter Clemenza. Once Michael made his move to Nevada, he had Clemenza operating territory in the Bronx off camera up until his death. It is also important to note that Peter had Frankie Pentangeli working under him and also the Rosado brothers as well. This is a key point we will come back to. Willie Sitchy's statement about Peter really makes you open your eyes that there's a possibility that he didn't die of a heart attack. Let's take a look at a few avenues that could have really led to Peter's death. The first one is that the Rosado brothers took out Clemenza and painted it as a heart attack. You see, in the second film, there's a dispute between Frankie Pentangeli and Michael about the Rosado brothers. Michael says Clemenza promised them to have 3 different territories in the Bronx, but once Frankie Pentangeli takes over, he doesn't give it to them. The reason is because it's discovered that they are backed by Hyman Roth, and Frankie despises them. Frankie also denies that Clemenza ever offered them anything in the first place, though he was without question drunk in this scene, so he may have been making this up. This is important because this establishes that the Rosado brothers were enemies to the Corleone family, rather than friends. The Rosado brothers were both gangsters, working under a boss called Giuseppe Mariposa in the 1930s before eventually working under Clemenza. Another important note is they also had ties to Rico Tattaglia, who was the younger brother to Philip. These hints all prove the Rosado brothers to be enemies to the Corleones, and definitely worthy of being responsible for Clemenza's death. Now, when Clemenza had hired them as soldiers, he probably thought of them as loyal and credible associates. And maybe they were at the time, but this judgment was fatal if it were the Rosado brothers who took him out. Clemenza's death is labeled as a heart attack while cooking food for his men. The brothers fall under the category of his men and could have very well been there. With Hyman being their boss, I wouldn't be surprised if he and the brothers were responsible for Clemenza's death, since Hyman is a very strategic and cunning man. Another angle to look at is that it was Michael who killed him all along. You may be thinking, what? How? Let me explain. Clemenza proved to be a loyal caporegime for decades, but certain people may have had their doubts. Let's look at this scene at Vito's funeral when Tom Hagen says,
I always thought it would have been Clemenza, not Tessio.
It's the smart move.
This statement is interesting, insinuating that the two very well may have had a discussion about the possibility of one of them being the traitor. I believe this could be true since Vito, Michael's consigliere at the time, tells him,
"You'll set up a meeting with someone that you absolutely trust, guaranteeing your safety."
And once Vito passes, who else could he have had the conversation with besides Tom? If this is the case, then Michael was suspicious of both Tessio and Clemenza, also realizing their unwillingness to adhere to Michael when he first became the Don, and that their loyalty was entrenched in Vito. Another interesting point is that Peter's soldier Paulie is a rat who almost gets Vito whacked. In part 1, Paulie called in sick on many occasions, and specifically on the day Vito was almost killed while getting fruit from a local vendor. And it is noted in the book that Sonny figured out Sollazzo was making phone calls to Paulie on multiple occasions. This may have heightened everyone's suspicion of Clemenza and his poor judgment. Michael, as I've discussed in previous videos, has an uncanny ability to read people around him and think as if he's them, which allows him to outsmart his foes, and was probably thinking about any possible outcome. And as we know, once Michael finds out someone betrays him, he becomes a psychopath about getting revenge. Now, it is never noted anywhere that Peter Clemenza started his own family or broke off from the Corleones. So it is possible that Clemenza was fed up with Michael and went behind his back to make a deal with Hyman Roth. It may be possible that Hyman made him an offer he couldn't refuse, which ultimately led to Michael whacking him. Was it actually Clemenza who almost had Michael assassinated? We'll leave that for another video, but Michael may have noticed inconsistencies in Clemenza's behavior toward the end, coupled with the fact that the Rosado brothers were working under Clemenza, even though they were tied to the Tattaglia family. Was he also trying to strike a deal with them too? These are all interesting viewpoints and a worthy consideration of who was behind his death. The third person who could be responsible for Clemenza's death is Frankie Pentangeli. As discussed earlier, Frankie worked under Clemenza until his death. But was he jealous of Clemenza the whole time? The caporegime in the mafia is a pretty high-ranking status, and Frankie knows that he will stay under Clemenza for much longer unless something mysterious happens to him, which happens. Another guy to factor in here is Willie Sicci, who also worked for Clemenza and then for Pentangeli. It could be possible that Sicci and Pentangeli devised a scheme to take out Peter, knowing they could paint it as the Rosado brothers. Subsequently, this could show Michael that they are owed none of the territory, and thus allowing Frankie to expand his newly acquired turf, with Sicci also moving up in the ranks. Also, it is clear that Don Michael said Clemenza promised territory to the Rosado brothers, and that pissed off Frankie. In the scene when he was drunk, he was furious about the fact he would have to share territory, and he might have thought that if he did take out Clemenza, he could have changed the narrative, explaining to Michael that the Corleone family owed the brothers nothing, and thus growing his turf. Another important point to note is that Pentangeli took over Clemenza's house after he died, which could further justify his jealousy. And that's the video. What do you think most likely happened to Clemenza? Comment below what you think. As always, thanks for watching and subscribe.